Politics, I often said, was not for the faint of heart. It was blood sport draped in silk, and every handshake carried the unspoken weight of calculation. But if there was one thing I had perfected, it was the art of the performance. My name is Daniel Hawthorne, and for the past 8 years, I have served as the junior senator for New York. At 51, with streaks of silver edging through my dark hair, I had cultivated the image of a man at the height of his career. The press called me the voice of reason, a moderate who walked the tightrope between progressives and conservatives with a surgeon's precision. I was untouchable, or so I thought. That November evening, the Waldorf Astoria shimmered like a jewel box beneath the Manhattan skyline, its marble columns and gold trim a perfect backdrop for power. It was a fundraiser gala, one of those glitzy affairs where donors sipped vintage champagne and whispered about tax reform between bites of foie gras. Evelyn, my wife of 22 years, stood beside me in a navy Givenchy dress that draped elegantly across her figure, her blonde hair pinned in soft curls. She was beautiful in the way that made people pause, but there was something else about her, a confidence that commanded attention. The daughter of a banking dynasty, she carried herself with the unshakable poise of someone who had grown up surrounded by wealth. "I thought tonight went well," she said, swirling the red wine in her glass. Her sapphire earrings caught the light as she tilted her head. "The press loved your response to the climate bill question. Gabriel mentioned it was trending already." Gabriel Marks, my campaign manager, sat across the table, half listening while typing furiously into his phone. He was 35, the youngest in my inner circle but by far the sharpest. Ivy League, fluent in Mandarin and Spanish, with the kind of ruthless ambition that had propelled him up the ranks faster than anyone expected. "It's a non-issue," I replied with a dismissive shrug. "The opposition will cling to whatever soundbite they can. This debate season has been more theater than policy." Evelyn laughed lightly, her hand brushing mine. "As long as the audience stays entertained." Gabriel looked up, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't underestimate them, Senator. Public sentiment is fickle." I gave him a brief smile. "That's why I have you to worry about it for me." The conversation drifted as more guests arrived at the table. A lobbyist from Chevron made a point to shake my hand for a few seconds too long, and the governor of Connecticut cornered Evelyn in a long-winded discussion about luxury art dealers. I watched as she nodded politely, offering the occasional charming laugh, and I marveled, not for the first time, at how seamlessly she fit into this world. It wasn't just Evelyn's beauty that kept the room orbiting around her. It was her ability to disarm without seeming disingenuous. "Your wife's a star," Gabriel said under his breath, watching her with careful attention. I sipped my whiskey. "She's always been." But there was something in his tone I didn't like. Later that evening, as the guests began to trickle out into the cool Manhattan air, Gabriel lingered. Evelyn kissed me lightly on the cheek and excused herself, leaving us in the private lounge of the hotel. "You seem distracted," I noted as I loosened my tie. Gabriel hesitated. "It's nothing. Just campaign logistics." I leaned back in the leather armchair, watching him closely. "Come on, Gabriel. I know you too well. What's bothering you?" For a brief moment, there was something behind his eyes. Hesitation, maybe. Then it was gone. "It's just the polling in Rochester. We may need to reshuffle the schedule a bit." I nodded slowly. "Fine. I'll review it in the morning." Gabriel rose from his seat, smoothing out his jacket. Evelyn already approved the adjustments. I frowned. I didn't realize Evelyn was in charge of campaign schedules. He offered a quick smile. "It was minor. She didn't want to bother you." I let it go, but as I watched him leave, the weight of something unspoken lingered between us. By the time I returned to our penthouse overlooking Central Park, Evelyn was already in bed, the glow of her tablet casting soft light across the room. She looked up as I entered, setting it aside with a graceful stretch. "You're late," she teased, sliding beneath the silk sheets. I loosened my cufflinks, studying her for a moment. "I didn't know you were managing the campaign schedule now." Her smile barely wavered. "Gabriel mentioned it during lunch. It was just a small shift. You've been too busy to handle every detail." I sat on the edge of the bed, the polished oak floor cool beneath my feet. "It's still unusual. I'd prefer to be informed." Evelyn propped herself up on one elbow, running her fingers along my back. You're overthinking it. Relax, Daniel. Everything's under control. I wanted to believe her, but as she kissed my shoulder, I caught a faint scent of unfamiliar cologne, one that didn't belong to me. I said nothing. The next morning, I met Gabriel for breakfast at the Peninsula. The restaurant was empty except for a few lobbyists nursing hangovers from the night before. As we waited for our orders, I pulled out my phone and casually scrolled through the calendar. The Rochester rally had indeed been rescheduled. Why the sudden change? I asked, glancing at him over the rim of my coffee cup. Gabriel didn't look up. Scheduling conflict. Nothing serious. Is that so? He finally met my gaze, his eyes guarded. Yes, Senator. That's so. I held his stare for a beat longer than necessary before setting the phone down. There was a crack forming, thin but unmistakable. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel it spreading beneath the surface. Politics, I reminded myself later that day as I delivered a speech at Columbia University, was about control. It was about ensuring that the ground beneath your feet stayed steady, even as the world around you shifted. But something had shifted, and I intended to find out why. The sun dipped low over the Capitol, casting long shadows across the marble floors of my office as I sat behind my desk, thumbing through briefing notes for the upcoming debate in Albany. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books, a deliberate touch Evelyn had insisted upon when we renovated. I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to that faint scent of cologne, the brush of Gabriel's gaze lingering just a second too long on my wife. I could rationalize it. That's what I told myself. Evelyn was attractive, and Gabriel was human. But the gut feeling gnawed at me, the same sensation I used to get before stepping into a room where I knew reporters were waiting with knives sharpened beneath their microphones. There was something here. I just wasn't sure how deep the rot went. Senator? I looked up to find Marissa, my assistant, standing at the door with her tablet tucked beneath one arm. You have a visitor. Mr. Marks is here to discuss the final debate points for next week. I nodded, straightening my tie. Send him in. Gabriel entered with his usual brisk energy, but there was a slight hesitance in his step. He carried a manila folder, which he set carefully on my desk. We need to talk about your closing statement for Albany, he began, avoiding eye contact as he pulled out a stack of papers. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands beneath my chin. Sit down, Gabriel. He hesitated. I'd rather stand, Senator. I insist. Slowly, he lowered himself into the leather chair across from me, his eyes flicking to the large window overlooking the Washington skyline. I've been thinking, I said carefully, about Rochester, and about Evelyn. Gabriel's jaw tightened just slightly, a flicker of a tell. I trust you, Gabriel, I continued, keeping my tone level. I expect the same in return. You have my trust, he replied quickly. Too quickly. Good, I said, offering a faint smile. Then tell me why Evelyn was involved in a decision that bypassed me entirely. His eyes darted to the papers on the desk. It wasn't intentional. She expressed concerns about timing, and I assumed she had already discussed it with you. She hadn't. Silence stretched between us, taut as a wire. Gabriel shifted in his seat. I apologize, Senator. It won't happen again. I'm sure it won't. But even as the conversation ended, the feeling in my gut persisted. That evening, I returned home later than usual, the weight of suspicion pressing down on me like a stone. Evelyn was seated at the grand piano in the corner of our living room, playing soft, mournful notes that echoed through the space. She didn't stop when I walked in. Late night? She asked without turning around. Campaign trail never sleeps. Her fingers danced across the keys, her focus entirely on the music. Gabriel called, she said after a moment. He said the debate prep went well. I poured myself a drink, watching her carefully. He mentioned you were quite involved in the scheduling process. She finally stopped playing, the last note hanging in the air like an accusation. I thought we weren't keeping score, she said, standing slowly. I took a sip of whiskey. I don't like surprises, Evelyn. She crossed the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. When she stopped in front of me, Her eyes held that same enigmatic glint I had learned to distrust. "Daniel," she said softly, placing her hand on my chest, "you're making this bigger than it needs to be." "Am I?" She leaned closer, her breath warm against my neck. "Gabriel admires you. But he's not a threat." I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond either. Evelyn stepped back, brushing an invisible speck off her dress. "You need to trust me." "I do," I lied. But that night, as she lay beside me in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing and wondering just how much of my life I had miscalculated. 3 days later, the first undeniable crack came in the form of an email. I was in my Senate office, reviewing intelligence reports when Marissa knocked softly. "Sir, you might want to take a look at this." She placed a tablet in front of me. I glanced at the screen, expecting some new policy briefing or scheduling update. Instead, I found an email thread forwarded anonymously. The subject line read, "Rochester, private correspondence." I scrolled down, reading carefully. "Gabriel, I trust you'll handle this discreetly. The senator can't know. The timing is important. Evelyn." Beneath it, Gabriel's response. "Understood. I'll ensure it's adjusted. The senator won't find out until after the debate." I sat back, the words burning into my mind. Marissa shifted awkwardly. "I thought you should see it, sir." I nodded, my pulse quickening. "Thank you, Marissa. Please keep this between us." As she left the office, I remained seated, staring at the email long after the screen dimmed. Gabriel wasn't just working behind my back. He was working with my wife. I used to believe that betrayal was something you could sense, that the people closest to you would betray themselves in the smallest of ways. A lingering glance, a missed call, an inexplicable shift in mood. But as I sat in my study, the cold glow of the tablet illuminating Evelyn's email to Gabriel, I realized that deception didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was quiet, insidious, slipping beneath the surface of your life until it became indistinguishable from routine. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of jazz drifting from the speakers in the kitchen. Evelyn had taken the kids to her parents' summer estate in Connecticut for the weekend, giving me space to prepare for the Albany debate. I should have welcomed the silence. Instead, it felt suffocating. "Gabriel, I trust you'll handle this discreetly. The senator can't know. The timing is important. Evelyn." Her words stared back at me like an indictment. I had trusted Evelyn implicitly for over 2 decades. We had built a life together, raised 2 children who were as much a reflection of us as they were of their own growing identities. And yet, here I was, dissecting every conversation, every touch, every offhand comment. Gabriel Marks had been by my side for the last 6 years, long enough to be part of the family, but not long enough to be untouchable. I took another sip of whiskey, letting the burns settle in my chest. "Dad?" The voice startled me, and I turned to find my son, Jack, standing in the doorway. He was 16, tall and lean with the sharp cheekbones Evelyn swore he inherited from me. His tie hung loose around his neck. The half-dressed stayed a clear indicator he was returning from some gathering I hadn't authorized. "What are you doing here?" I asked, setting the tablet face down. Jack shrugged, running a hand through his dark hair. "I came back early. Mom's still in Connecticut with Emily, my daughter, 11 going on 25. If Jack was my mirror, Emily was Evelyn's. Sharp, perceptive, and unrelentingly stubborn. She had Evelyn's poise and sharp blue eyes, and even at her young age, she could walk into a room and command attention. I glanced at the clock. "It's late. Where were you?" "Just out with friends," Jack replied casually, though the slight hesitation in his voice didn't escape me. "Friends?" I repeated. "Which ones?" "Thomas, Sam." He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "And Grace." Grace Whitmore, the governor's daughter. A dangerous choice for teenage rebellion, given the political scrutiny we were under. I nodded toward the staircase. "Get to bed. We'll talk about this in the morning." Jack exhaled in relief and disappeared down the hall. I waited until I heard the creak of his door closing before returning to the email. The next morning, I stood in the doorway to Jack's room, watching as he stuffed a tangle of books and clothes into his backpack. "Where's Mom?" he asked without looking up. "She'll be back this evening." Jack hesitated. "She seemed weird when we were in Connecticut." I leaned against the frame. "Weird how?" He shrugged. "Just distant. She spent a lot of time on the phone with Gabriel." The casual mention hit me like a slap. I kept my expression calm. "Did she say anything about why?" "No," Jack said. "Just campaign stuff, I guess." "Campaign stuff." I nodded, offering a faint smile. "Go easy on her, Jack. She's under a lot of stress with the election coming up." Jack laughed under his breath. "I'm sure Gabriel's helping with that." He said it as a joke, but the words lingered long after he left for school. Later that evening, Evelyn returned home. Emily was the first to greet her, sprinting down the hallway with the kind of enthusiasm only an 11-year-old could muster. Evelyn knelt to embrace her, murmuring soft words into her ear as if nothing had changed. Jack followed, offering a brief hug before retreating upstairs to avoid the inevitable dinner-time conversations. I watched it all from the study, sipping my whiskey in silence. Evelyn caught my gaze over Emily's shoulder, her expression betraying nothing. As the kids drifted into their rooms, Evelyn approached slowly, crossing the threshold of the study like it was enemy territory. "Jack mentioned Gabriel called you while you were in Connecticut," I said casually. She arched a brow, tossing her handbag onto the chair. "Jack has a habit of eavesdropping. It was just about the debate?" I nodded. "Right, the debate." Evelyn perched on the arm of the leather chair, folding her arms across her lap. "Daniel, if you have something to ask me, just say it." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Are you working with Gabriel behind my back?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Evelyn met my gaze without flinching. "I'm working for you, Daniel. Not against you." That wasn't the question. Her lips pressed together into a thin line. "Gabriel and I have discussed strategy, yes. But it's not what you think." "What do I think?" Evelyn exhaled sharply, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "I know you're paranoid this close to the election, but Gabriel's loyal. He's invested in your success." "Is he?" I asked, tilting my head. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like he's more invested in you." Her gaze darkened, and for a moment, I saw the ice behind her eyes, the side of Evelyn she rarely showed. "You don't trust me," she said quietly. I stood, crossing the room until I was inches from her. "I don't trust anyone right now, least of all my campaign manager and wife exchanging secret emails." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward the tablet on the desk. Her expression tightened, but she said nothing. "I'm not blind," I continued. "I know something's going on. The only question is how much of it you're willing to admit before I find out the rest." For a moment, I thought she might crack, but instead, Evelyn straightened, smoothing the creases from her dress with practiced elegance. "You're right," she said, brushing past me. "You're not blind." And then she left the room, the faint echo of her heels the only sound that remained. As I stood in the empty study, one thing became clear. Whatever was happening between Evelyn and Gabriel wasn't just a distraction. It was a threat, and threats, in my world, were not something I could afford to ignore. The Albany debate was 4 days away, but the tension in the house felt as though the event had already arrived. Evelyn was distant, more so than usual, and Gabriel's phone calls had become more frequent, slipping in between school pickups and campaign strategy meetings. Jack noticed, though he said nothing directly. Emily, on the other hand, adored Gabriel. She chirped about him constantly, how he had brought her a scarf from Paris after his last trip, how he joked with her about soccer when Evelyn dragged the kids to campaign events. It wasn't unusual, but lately, every mention of him felt like a needle under my skin. I didn't mind Gabriel being good with the kids. What I minded was how easily he had slipped into the cracks of my family. I was pacing in my study, staring out over the darkened Central Park skyline when Jack appeared at the door. "Is everything okay?" he asked, lingering at the threshold. I forced a smile. "Of course. Why?" He hesitated, hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. "You're acting weird. Is it about the campaign?" "In a way," I replied. Jack leaned against the doorframe. "Mom's been weird too. Gabriel's around all the time." I looked at him sharply, but Jack wasn't meeting my gaze. "He's helping her," I said carefully. Jack's eyes flicked toward me, and for the first time, I saw that same sharpness Evelyn carried in her. She says that, Jack replied. But I don't know. He's too familiar. He doesn't act like a campaign manager. I studied him, surprised by the astuteness. Jack wasn't naive, but I didn't think he'd been paying enough attention to notice the subtleties between Evelyn and Gabriel. I'll handle it, I said. Jack gave a faint nod, his eyes narrowing slightly. I know you will. He left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of his unspoken suspicions. The next day, I tested the waters. I made a point to arrive home early, cutting a fundraiser in the city short. Evelyn wasn't expecting me, which was precisely the reason I did it. When I opened the front door, laughter floated from the living room. I recognized Emily's giggle first, but the deeper voice that followed made my pulse quicken. Gabriel. I stepped quietly into the hall, pausing just before I reached the doorway. From where I stood, I could see them. Gabriel seated on the couch, his suit jacket slung over the armrest, Emily curled up beside him as he scrolled through something on his phone. Evelyn sat nearby, her glass of wine half empty. She was smiling, but not the way she smiled at me. It was subtle, familiar. I had seen that look before, years ago when we first met. The quiet intimacy of it cut deeper than I expected. I didn't realize you were hosting, I said, stepping into the room. Evelyn's gaze flickered toward me, and for a brief second, I saw something there. Panic, quickly masked by indifference. Daniel, she said smoothly, rising from her seat. You're home early. Gabriel straightened, offering a polite nod. Senator. Evelyn asked me to go over the Albany plans with her tonight. I hope you don't mind. I smiled thinly. Not at all. But I prefer campaign discussions to happen in the office, not my living room. Emily tugged at Gabriel's sleeve. He was showing me pictures of his trip to Rome. I kept my gaze fixed on Evelyn. Emily, go upstairs. I need to speak with your mother and Mr. Marks alone. Emily frowned, but Evelyn stepped in. Go on, sweetheart. We'll be up soon. As Emily bounded up the stairs, Gabriel shifted, sensing the tension that had filled the room. Daniel, Evelyn began, but I cut her off. No more games, I said quietly, my gaze locking onto Gabriel. I want the truth. Gabriel raised his hands slightly, as if in surrender. There's nothing inappropriate happening here, Senator. Inappropriate? That's a curious word for it, I replied, stepping closer. You've been working closely with my wife, closer than any campaign manager needs to. I've tolerated it because I assumed I could trust both of you. I'm beginning to question that assumption. Gabriel glanced at Evelyn, but she gave no signal. I respect you, Daniel, Gabriel said. I wouldn't jeopardize what we've built. Then explain the email. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. What email? I retrieved my phone, opening the screenshot I had taken of their correspondence and holding it out for both of them to see. Gabriel, I trust you'll handle this discreetly. The senator can't know. Evelyn's face paled, but Gabriel barely blinked. It wasn't what you think, Gabriel said carefully. We were discussing polling discrepancies, ones we didn't want leaked until we verified them. I glanced at Evelyn. And you couldn't tell me this directly? Her voice was cold. I was trying to protect you from unnecessary distractions. I laughed under my breath, stepping back. You thought protecting me meant lying to me? Don't do this, Daniel, Evelyn said sharply, her composure cracking for the first time. You're overreacting. Am I? I asked, my voice hardening. Or is this just the beginning of something you're not ready to admit? Silence stretched between us. Gabriel shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two of us. I should leave. No, I said, never taking my eyes off Evelyn. You're staying until I get an answer. Evelyn's gaze flickered, and for the first time, I saw it. The faint glimmer of guilt. It wasn't confirmation, but it was close enough. Gabriel cleared his throat, grabbing his jacket. With all due respect, Senator, I think you're looking for problems that aren't there. I met his gaze, letting the weight of my silence press down on him. Then I suggest you stay far away from my home, Gabriel. From now on, your interactions with my family happen at campaign headquarters. Am I clear? Gabriel nodded stiffly, retreating toward the door. When he was gone, Evelyn crossed her arms, staring me down. "You're making a mistake," she said softly. I leaned in close, my voice low. "No, Evelyn. I'm just finally seeing the truth." I didn't expect to find myself standing outside Gabriel's apartment at 1 in the morning. It wasn't planned. I had left the office late, the weight of the campaign and the tension at home pressing down on me like a vice. I had intended to drive straight back to the penthouse, but somehow, my car wound its way through the streets of D.C., drifting into the quiet neighborhoods near DuPont Circle where Gabriel lived. I told myself it was paranoia, that Evelyn's coldness and the email exchange were nothing more than campaign stress manifesting in ugly ways. But as I parked discreetly across the street, I couldn't force myself to leave. The lights were on in Gabriel's corner unit. I recognized Evelyn's silhouette immediately, framed by the warm glow of his living room window. She was supposed to be at home, putting Emily to bed. My chest tightened, and I felt the creeping burn of humiliation rise up my throat. I pulled out my phone, resting it on the dashboard, recording as I zoomed in on the window. They weren't touching. Evelyn sat across from Gabriel, glass of wine in hand, legs crossed casually as she spoke. Gabriel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, nodding as she talked. I wanted to believe it was innocent, but I knew better. I was about to stop recording when something shifted. Evelyn stood, walking slowly around the coffee table until she was standing behind Gabriel's chair. Her hands rested lightly on his shoulders, the way she used to touch me when I was working late, offering quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone. Gabriel tilted his head up to look at her, saying something I couldn't hear through the glass. Evelyn laughed. The sound of it twisted something inside me. I opened the car door, stepping out into the cool air, phone still in hand. I crossed the street, heart pounding, until I stood beneath the open window, just out of sight but close enough to hear. "You worry too much," Evelyn was saying, her voice light but edged with condescension. "Daniel's oblivious. He's too busy pretending to be a crusader for the working class to notice what's right in front of him." Gabriel chuckled softly. "I don't like the secrecy. It's risky, Evelyn. He's already suspicious." Evelyn's sigh drifted down to me like a knife. "Let him be suspicious," she replied dismissively. "It's not like he can do anything about it. He's so desperate to keep the family image intact that he'd rather swallow his pride than confront me." I tightened my grip on the phone, blood roaring in my ears. Gabriel shifted in his chair. "Still, I feel like you're here more than you should be. What if someone sees you leaving?" There was a long pause before Evelyn laughed again, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed through the night. "Gabriel," she said quietly, "no one's watching. And even if they were, it's not like we're sleeping together." I froze. "That's the one thing I could never fake," Evelyn continued. "God knows I've tried." Gabriel stiffened. "Evelyn." "Oh, don't act like you didn't know," she cut him off. "You're charming, Gabriel, but you're hardly a threat. If I was looking for passion, I'd be with someone else. Someone who could actually perform." I nearly dropped the phone. Gabriel shifted uncomfortably, lowering his voice. "That's not fair." Evelyn's tone sharpened. "Fair," she snapped. "What's not fair is that I've spent the last 2 years covering for you. You think I enjoy this? Do you know how exhausting it is pretending to be satisfied by a man who can't even?" She stopped abruptly, but the damage was done. I remained frozen beneath the window, bile rising in my throat. Gabriel stood, pacing. "I'm doing my best." "Your best," Evelyn sneered. "Your best leaves me cold, Gabriel. Do you know how humiliating it is to fake climaxes for a man who—" I stepped forward, the sound of my shoes scraping against the pavement loud enough for Gabriel to hear. His head jerked toward the window, eyes widening as he caught sight of me below. He stepped back quickly, his face paling. "Evelyn." Evelyn turned to follow his gaze. When she saw me, the color drained from her face. I held up the phone, the red recording light blinking as I met her eyes. For the first time in years, Evelyn was speechless. The silence in the car on the drive home was suffocating. Evelyn sat stiffly in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window as though looking at me would shatter whatever fragile barrier still separated us. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked finally, her voice low. I didn't answer. She shifted, leaning slightly toward me. "Daniel, it wasn't." "Don't." My voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. Evelyn fell silent. When we pulled into the garage, she lingered as I stepped out of the car. I rounded the hood slowly, pausing at the door. "You're sleeping in the guest room tonight," I said without looking at her. She scoffed softly. "You're overreacting." I turned to face her, holding up the phone again, playing the recording back at full volume. Her voice echoed through the garage. "Do you know how humiliating it is to fake orgasms for a man who—" Evelyn's expression twisted, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "You think you're clever," she said coldly, "but you'll ruin yourself, Daniel. A scandal like this won't just cost you the election, it'll destroy the family. Is that what you want?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I'd rather burn the entire house down," I whispered, "than live another day under the same roof as you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing else. She pushed past me, disappearing down the hall without another word. As I stood in the empty garage, phone still in hand, I realized this wasn't just betrayal. This was war. I didn't sleep that night. Evelyn's words echoed in my head like a gunshot in an empty hall. Each syllable scraped against my pride, cutting deeper than I thought possible. I lay in the dark guest room, the house eerily silent except for the faint hum of the central heating. The recording sat on my phone, untouched but ever-present. I played it twice more, not because I needed to hear it again, but because I wanted the sting to stay fresh. Anger, I found, was an excellent motivator. By sunrise, the outline of my plan had crystallized. I would not rage, not scream, and certainly not beg. This would not be an explosive confrontation where I stormed out, leaving Evelyn to explain away my absence with carefully spun lies. No, I would dismantle her world with the same surgical precision I'd used in the Senate for years. And I'd start with Gabriel Marks. At breakfast, Evelyn acted as if nothing had happened. She sat across from me at the Marble Island, sipping black coffee and scrolling through her phone. She had dressed impeccably, of course, cream-colored silk blouse, diamond earrings, the very image of the devoted political wife. "Emily has a recital tonight," she said without looking up. "I told her you'd be there." I flipped the page of the newspaper without responding. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and assessing. "I assume you're not planning to sulk in the guest room indefinitely?" I folded the newspaper carefully, setting it down with measured calm. "You'll know when I'm done sulking, Evelyn." She smirked, setting her coffee down. "You think you're intimidating. It's honestly adorable." I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to watch her confidence falter. "Barely, but enough." "I'm glad you find this amusing," I said. "I wonder if Gabriel will feel the same way." The slight twitch in her hand betrayed her. "Oh, come on, Daniel," she said, brushing it off. "You're not going to ruin your career over this. Be reasonable. I may have stepped over a line, but you can't afford to. Not now." I stood, pushing my chair back deliberately. "I'm always reasonable." Evelyn arched a brow, watching me with thinly veiled amusement as I left the kitchen. She thought this was a game. That was her first mistake. 10 a.m., campaign headquarters. Gabriel looked like he hadn't slept either, but for entirely different reasons. I found him in his office, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, phone pressed to his ear. His jacket was slung over the chair, shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the tense lines of his forearm as he gestured at something unseen. "Yeah, I know. I'll smooth it over. We can't afford a delay now." I knocked lightly on the glass door. Gabriel froze, slowly lowering his phone. "Senator," he greeted, forcing a smile. "I wasn't expecting you this early." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "I thought it was time for a chat." He hesitated. "Of course. Let me just—" "Sit down, Gabriel." His smile faltered, but he obeyed, sinking into the leather chair across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I let the silence simmer, watching as the nervous tap of his fingers against the armrest quickened. "About last night," Gabriel began, but I cut him off. I'm not here to discuss Evelyn. He looked surprised. You're not? No, I said calmly. I'm here to inform you of your resignation. Gabriel blinked, shifting forward in his chair. Senator, I think you're overreacting. Evelyn and I don't care what you think. I leaned in, dropping my voice. This isn't about Evelyn. It's about loyalty. And you, Gabriel, have violated that trust. He swallowed hard, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was trying to assess how much I knew, how deep the rot had spread. You need me, he said carefully, clasping his hands together. I've built this campaign from the ground up. Replacing me now, this close to the debate, is risky. I smiled thinly. That's exactly why you'll stay until Albany. After that, you'll resign for personal reasons, and I'll make sure you land on your feet somewhere distant. Very distant. Gabriel's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. I understand. I stood, straightening my jacket. I'm glad we had this talk. As I opened the door to leave, Gabriel's voice stopped me. Does Evelyn know? I turned, meeting his gaze. She doesn't need to, I replied coldly. Gabriel exhaled slowly, his confidence bleeding away. He understood now. His career wasn't just ending. It was being cauterized. That evening, Evelyn found me in the study. She leaned against the doorframe, watching as I poured a glass of whiskey. Gabriel called, she said lightly. Sounded upset. I swirled the amber liquid, not bothering to look up. Did he? Evelyn stepped inside, crossing the room to perch on the edge of my desk. You really think getting rid of him will fix anything? She asked, her tone soft but mocking. I took a slow sip, letting the silence linger. No, I admitted, but it's a start. She laughed softly, shaking her head. You're so predictable, Daniel. Always trying to control the narrative. It's pathetic, really. I placed the glass down carefully, standing so that I towered over her. You mistake my patience for weakness, Evelyn, I said quietly. But you'll learn the difference soon enough. Her smirk faded, but she didn't retreat. Oh, I'm terrified, she said sarcastically, sliding off the desk. But remember, darling, when this all falls apart, I'll be the one left standing, not you. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, the softness of her lips a direct contradiction to the venom behind her words. As she left the room, I retrieved my phone from my pocket, pulling up the recording one more time. Your best leaves me cold, Gabriel. I smiled grimly. Evelyn had no idea just how much of her world I was about to dismantle. The lights were blinding, the hum of the audience filling the expansive hall of the Albany Convention Center. Over 600 people sat in the crowd, with thousands more watching live on national television. The debate was supposed to be the final push before Election Day, the last chance to solidify my lead over Congressman Nathan Foley. But tonight, the debate wasn't just about politics. It was about revenge. I stood at the podium, my hands resting lightly against the sides, the crisp navy suit tailored perfectly. Across from me, Foley droned on about tax policy, his nasal tone blending into the background. My mind wasn't on policy. It was on Evelyn, seated front row center, with Gabriel at her side. Their eyes never met mine. Good. They had reason to avoid my gaze. Evelyn had dressed to perfection, as always. Blood-red Prada dress, diamond earrings, blonde hair styled just right. She played the part of the dutiful senator's wife impeccably, smiling and nodding when necessary. A mask of poise over a rotting foundation. I could feel the weight of the flash drive in my pocket, the recording I had been saving for the perfect moment. I waited until Foley finished his tirade. The moderator, a sharp-eyed woman from CNN, turned to me. Senator Hawthorne, your response? I adjusted the microphone, letting the silence stretch just long enough to stir tension in the room. Thank you, I said smoothly. It's a fascinating thing, Congressman Foley, to talk about trust and leadership, because in my experience, trust begins at home. Foley smirked, leaning slightly forward. Is this where you give us a lecture on family values, Senator? A ripple of laughter spread across the audience. I smiled faintly. Something like that, I replied. You see, Congressman, I've always believed the strength of a man lies in the people closest to him, his family, his team. But what happens when the people you trust most betray you? Gabriel stiffened in his seat. Evelyn's grip on her clutch tightened. I continued, eyes locked on Foley but voice aimed straight at the front row. I learned recently that even the closest alliances can shatter, I said, pausing deliberately. And when they do, the fallout isn't just personal. It's public, painfully public. The moderator's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the shift in tone. Foley chuckled nervously. Senator, I'm not sure this is relevant to. Oh, it's relevant. I cut in, my voice dropping a register. I reached into my pocket, producing the flash drive. I held it up, letting the camera linger on it. This, I said, contains a conversation. One that I imagine will interest the audience tonight. Evelyn's face paled. Gabriel leaned forward in his chair, his jaw tightening as he realized what was coming. The moderator leaned toward her mic. Senator Hawthorne, what exactly are you implying? I didn't answer her. Instead, I pressed a small button on the podium. The audio filled the hall instantly, booming from the speakers overhead. Your best leaves me cold, Gabriel. Do you know how humiliating it is to fake climaxes for a man who can't even? A gasp spread through the audience like wildfire. Evelyn shot to her feet, knocking her chair backward as the audio played on, her voice filling every corner of the room. Daniel's oblivious. He's too busy pretending to be a crusader for the working class to notice what's right in front of him. I let it play for a few more seconds, the raw contempt in Evelyn's voice cutting through the stunned silence. She stormed toward the stage, heels clicking violently against the floor. You bastard, she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. You think this makes you look strong? You're pathetic. You've always been pathetic. Gasps turned to murmurs. Foley glanced at the moderator, unsure whether to intervene. I stepped back, letting Evelyn spiral. This was her stage now. You know what the truth is, Daniel, she screamed, shaking with rage. You want to expose me? Fine. Let's talk about you for once. Let's talk about how you've never been able to satisfy me. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with your career, you'd have noticed I had to go elsewhere. The crowd rippled with stunned whispers. You have a small weenie. Evelyn roared, her voice cracking. You think I faked it with Gabriel? I faked it with you for 20 years. Security had started moving in, but I raised a hand to stop them. Let her burn the whole house down. You think this is revenge, Daniel? You're nothing but a bitter, impotent man. An empty suit parading as something important. The words stung, but I didn't flinch. I let them pour out, wave after wave, until she finally ran out of breath, panting and trembling at the base of the stage. Gabriel hadn't moved. He stared blankly at the floor, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. Are you finished? I asked calmly, adjusting the mic. Evelyn glared up at me, seething, but she said nothing. Thank you for your honesty, I said softly. It seems the voters now have a clearer view of the household that supports me. The audience erupted, half in laughter, half in shock. Foley buried his face in his hands, shaking his head. Evelyn stormed out of the hall, shoving through the crowd. I didn't watch her leave. I turned back to the moderator, offering a faint smile. My apologies for the interruption, I said smoothly. Shall we return to tax policy? The debate continued, but by the time I left the stage, I knew the headlines would write themselves. I didn't need to bury Evelyn or Gabriel. They had done it themselves. That night, I sat alone in the penthouse, whiskey in hand, watching as the news cycle devoured the footage. Scandal rocks Senator Hawthorne's campaign. Wife's explosive outburst caught on live TV. Gabriel Marks resigns amid affair allegations. Insider sources suggest more to come. By morning, Gabriel's career would be over. Evelyn's reputation, shattered. And I would walk away untouched. I didn't win this election by being the better man. I won it by being the last one standing. The Albany Convention Center incident became an instant sensation. By the next morning, every major news outlet was dissecting Evelyn's meltdown, replaying her venomous rant about my inadequacies and Gabriel's shortcomings on an endless loop. I watched it all from the penthouse, sipping black coffee in the stillness of my study while the world outside spun into chaos. CNN's headline read, Hawthorne debate scandal, Wife's explosive affair confession captivates the nation. MSNBC was more brutal. The impotent senator, Hawthorne's private life goes public. It should have humiliated me. Instead, the numbers rolled in like a flood. By noon, Foley's campaign had issued a weak, pre-written statement condemning Evelyn's outburst, calling for decorum and focus on policy issues, but it was too late. His attempts to take the moral high ground evaporated as his polling numbers cratered overnight. Apparently, voters found a man standing firm while his wife detonated their marriage on live television to be relatable. 2 days later, I was back in D.C., and the pieces began to fall. Gabriel's resignation landed on my desk before I even asked for it. I accepted it with zero fanfare. By evening, rumors were swirling that he'd fled to Los Angeles, where he was rumored to be pursuing a quiet PR role for some B-tier tech startup. He wouldn't resurface in politics again. Evelyn, however, wasn't as lucky. The divorce proceedings were merciless. Evelyn had no idea how deeply I had prepared for this day. Every joint account, every shared investment, carefully maneuvered to minimize her payout. Over the years, I had quietly transferred funds into separate trusts, shielding assets beneath a layer of legal complexity that Evelyn's lawyers never saw coming. She sat across from me in the conference room at Whitmore and Bass, arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring as my attorney, an absolute shark named Hannah Grayson, walked through the settlement terms. "You're joking," Evelyn hissed, interrupting mid-sentence. Hannah smiled coolly. "I'm afraid not. Based on the prenup, your client leaves with precisely what she brought into the marriage." Evelyn's eyes snapped to me. "You can't be serious. I raised your children. I held this family together." I leaned back, folding my hands across the polished oak table. "You held it together with Gabriel's limp weenie, I recall." Her face flushed crimson, but she couldn't deny it. Hannah continued without blinking. "You'll retain the condo in Manhattan," she said, flipping through documents. "However, since Senator Hawthorne's name is on the mortgage, you'll assume full responsibility for the remaining payments. Alimony is denied under the conditions of infidelity." Evelyn shot forward in her chair. "I won't survive on that. What am I supposed to do?" "You could get a job," Hannah replied flatly. Evelyn's mouth opened, but nothing came out. This wasn't the cushy divorce she had envisioned. She had expected a settlement big enough to keep her in Prada and luxury vacations for years. Instead, she was left staring at a stack of bills, a crumbling reputation, and a hollow marriage. "Daniel," she said finally, dropping the anger for something softer, "you don't have to do this. We can work something out, off the record. For the children's sake." The mention of Jack and Emily might have swayed me once. Not anymore. "They'll stay with me," I replied, watching her carefully. "You'll have visitation, but I'll pursue full custody." Her eyes narrowed. "The court won't allow that." I smiled faintly. "You really want to fight me for custody after the debate?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. She wasn't stupid. That audio, combined with her public breakdown, painted her as an unstable, unfaithful spouse. No judge in New York would risk putting 2 children in her care, not when I had meticulously shaped the image of a stable, devoted father. Jack hadn't spoken to her since the incident. Emily, confused and hurt, stayed glued to my side. Evelyn's shoulders sank as reality set in. I stood, gathering my papers and sliding them neatly into my briefcase. "Consider this mercy," I said softly. "If you make this clean, I won't drag your name any further through the mud." She looked at me, biting back the furious tears that welled behind her eyes. "You'll regret this." I smiled faintly. "I doubt it." 3 weeks later, Evelyn packed what little she had left into her white Mercedes and pulled out of our driveway for the last time. Jack stood beside me on the front steps, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, while Emily waved politely but without much enthusiasm. "She'll be fine," I told them, watching as the taillights disappeared down the street. "She always lands on her feet." Emily leaned into my side, and I kissed the top of her head. Jack waited until she had gone inside before glancing up at me. "Is it weird that I'm not sad?" I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not at all." He nodded quietly, disappearing into the house. The day felt lighter somehow, as if the weight Evelyn had left in our lives had finally lifted. Election night. 3 weeks later, I stood on the stage of the Waldorf Astoria, bathed in bright lights and thunderous applause. The results were in. Landslide victory. Foley had collapsed beneath the pressure, scandal nipping at his heels after one of his campaign managers was exposed for embezzlement. The opposition never recovered. As I delivered my victory speech, I glanced toward the empty seat at the front of the stage, the one where Evelyn would have sat. Instead, Jack and Emily flanked me, their presence more powerful than any photo op with a scandal-ridden wife. Evelyn's absence told a story, one the public had already decided for themselves, and I was happy to let that narrative unfold. 6 months later, I heard Evelyn was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, working part-time for an interior design firm that catered to mid-tier clients. The Mercedes had been repossessed, and rumor had it she was renting a Honda. Gabriel, last I checked, was giving PR seminars in Los Angeles. I never called her. Jack and Emily never asked to visit. It turns out, when the house of cards falls, the queen doesn't always land on her feet. And I stood taller than ever, the last one left standing, with nothing but clear skies ahead. A year after the election, the world felt quieter. The Senate floor no longer felt like a battlefield, and the relentless pressure of the campaign trail had finally subsided. I found solace in the stillness of my new life, one defined by routine, simplicity, and the absence of Evelyn's cutting remarks. Jack had started his first year at Columbia, driven by the quiet determination that reminded me of myself at his age. Emily, now 12, had developed a passion for soccer, and I never missed a game. Watching her grow, I wondered how much of her confidence stemmed from the stability I'd built for us in the aftermath of the divorce. The apartment felt warmer these days, more like a home than it had in years. I hadn't heard from Evelyn in months, until she called one evening. The phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, flashing her name like a relic from a life I thought I had left behind. I let it ring, but as I stood there, watching the call go to voicemail, a flicker of curiosity gnawed at me. I hit play. Her voice came through soft, almost fragile, like the Evelyn I had known years ago, before ambition had hardened her. "Daniel, it's me. I know it's been a while." A pause. "I wouldn't call if I didn't need to, but things aren't great right now. I lost the apartment. I'm staying with a friend, but it's temporary." She exhaled shakily, and I could hear the strain behind her words. "I need help, Daniel. Not for me, but for the kids. I miss them." Her voice broke slightly, though whether it was genuine or calculated, I couldn't tell. "Jack won't return my calls, and Emily, she doesn't even ask about me anymore. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still their mother." There it was, the vulnerability she had always weaponized when she wanted something. "I was hoping, maybe you could lend me something to get back on my feet. Just enough for a place. I'm not asking for much. I'll pay you back. I just need a fresh start. Please." The message ended abruptly, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I stared at the phone for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of Emily's laughter from the living room. Evelyn's voice lingered in my mind, but I wasn't the same man I had been when she left. Later that night, Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, thumbing through her phone while I finished the dishes. "Mom called today," I said casually, drying a plate. Emily's fingers paused over the screen. She didn't look up. "What did she want?" "She says she misses you. Wants to see you." Emily shrugged, her attention drifting back to her phone. "She always says that." I watched her for a moment, noting the absence of longing in her voice. It wasn't anger or resentment, just indifference, the kind that sets in when someone disappears long enough to become a stranger. "Would you want to see her?" I asked carefully. Emily hesitated, biting her lip. "Not really." I nodded. "Okay." She shifted uncomfortably. "Is she okay?" "She's figuring things out," I replied. Emily glanced at me, as if searching for a deeper meaning behind my words. "You're not going to give her money, are you?" The question surprised me. "What makes you ask that?" "She used to ask Grandma for money all the time," Emily said flatly. "She always said it was for us, but we never saw it." I folded the dish towel, leaning against the counter. No, I said finally. I'm not giving her anything. Emily nodded quietly, her eyes drifting back to her phone, but I could see the faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called again. This time, I answered. Daniel, she began softly, I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I'm full of surprises, I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause, followed by the faintest exhale of relief. I just wanted to check in. I'm sorry for the last call. I didn't mean to put you in that position. You're not in a position to put me anywhere, Evelyn, I replied calmly. She hesitated. I know. I was hoping we could meet, just to talk. About the kids. I let the silence hang for a moment. You should focus on yourself, I said quietly. Emily and Jack are doing just fine without you. Evelyn's breath hitched slightly, but she recovered quickly. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me fall apart. No, I replied. I'm just busy holding things together. There was nothing left to say after that. A year later, Jack came home for Thanksgiving break, his laughter filling the house once again as Emily tugged him into the kitchen to taste test the turkey. The house smelled of rosemary and cinnamon, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. I stood by the window, looking out over the city as snow began to drift down in lazy spirals. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. Evelyn's name no longer lingered in the air like a shadow. She had faded into the background, just another cautionary tale of betrayal and consequence. And as I watched my children laugh, I realized something. I hadn't just survived the storm. I had rebuilt stronger than before.